might get started. Welcome everybody. I'd just like to start by acknowledging that we're on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect and welcome to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us today. My name's Liz, I'm one of the Associate Directors here in the library, and it's my pleasure today to introduce our first Rare Bites, I think since the Halcyon days of 2019. It's been a while since we've been able to do these in person, so it's very exciting. And it's extra exciting to have this with our inaugural Selby Old Fellow in Religious History of the Orthodox Christian Faith. So this is a brand new program for us and a first for the library to have this sort of fellowship. It uses one of our long-standing bequests in a slightly different way. Rather than using it just to acquire new material, we're using it to get a better understanding of our existing collections. Which is what Doru is going to take us through today. So Dr Doru Costache is our inaugural Selby Old Fellow, and he's been with us now for nearly a year. Beavering away, a lot of that was done at the end of last year during lockdown, so overcoming the sort of remote access to collections issues. But since then he's been spending quite a bit of time with this lovely item here, our Codex Angus. And I'm looking forward to hearing what he's discovered about it today and where it might lead us for future discoveries as well. So please join me in welcoming Doru.
Thank you, Liz, and everyone. It's a privilege for me. Well, it's the first Rare Bite after so long, but for me it's the first. So, without further delay, Codex Angus. We have the item here, beautifully restored by Barbara, whom I met just today. It is my duty and privilege and honor to acknowledge the Selby Old Foundation. For this privilege, I was given to be the inaugural recipient of the Selby Old Fellowship in Religious History of the Orthodox Christian Faith. Thank you, Liz, a mouthful. As well as the wonderful team of Fisher Libraries, Rare Books and Special Collections with whom I have worked so profitably throughout my year-long tenure. It has been quite a ride, and as Liz already pointed out, I have worked on a number of things because of the lockdown, so my current projects, a couple of them actually, are in the area of Orthodox studies, but this is new, and this has been a very welcome challenge for me for a reason that it'll become obvious in a moment. What I try to say today, just to walk you through the parts of my talk, what do we know about Codex Angus? Then, to put the Codex in a certain context, I have to talk briefly about Byzantine lectionaries, gospel lectionaries, and then a brief description of the Codex and some of my findings and thoughts, inferences, if you like. Now, what do we know? Very little, unfortunately. Of course, we have in the library, in the catalog, we have a description there. Codex Angus is supposedly from the 12th century, question mark, perhaps written in Constantinople. I would add a question mark there, and not much else. The most recent studies that I could find are listed here by two foreign scholars, one German, Albrecht Geber, and the other one French, Jean-Marie Olivier. The references that these two articles, the articles of these two gentlemen contain are very useful, but for those who will be interested in browsing these two articles, it'll be a strange discovery. There isn't much out there about the Codex itself. So the two scholars have come to Sydney to study the Codex for other purposes. So the discovery of the Codex was, I assume, tangential. They were working on something else, but I'm grateful for, and we should be grateful for their research, which mainly has to do with the history of acquisition rather than the actual making of the codex. And of course we have a very brief YouTube video by Julie. So this is pretty much it. Of course you have to dig further to find more stuff. And I repeat, this is a pity. They are related in that Olivier, the second author, refers to the first author, Geber, pointing out the fact that he disagrees with the dating of the manuscript and also with the place of it making or perhaps preservation. Roughly what we know is that it might be a manuscript from the 11th or 12th century. The second author, Jean-Marie Olivier, says 13th century. What else do we know is that the manuscript was kept for an indeterminate time in a monastery in northwest Greece. The monastery is called Kosinitsa, which is popular shorthand of longer term Theotokos Ikosiphinissa, I think that's the pronunciation, which means the monastery dedicated to the Lord's mother or the birth giver of God, that's Theotokos. Ikosiphinissa means 12 fig trees. Okay, so because it's a mouthful, popularly the monastery was called Kosinitsa, so it's a shorthand. The monastery was ransacked, as you see there on the slides, during the First World War by the Bulgarians, raiders, which were led by an aficionado of manuscripts, a Czech self-made scholar, Sis, I think by name. Somehow this manuscript reached Bulgaria, where it was kept in different places, assumingly for a while. Again, dots, dots, dots. We don't know anything for certain. Where it was retrieved by a German scholar, Adolf Deissmann, I think, and brought to Berlin. And from Berlin, it reached Sydney, given the diligences of Samuel Angus, who died in 1943, who was a disciple of Deissmann in Berlin and who managed to convince Deissmann to surrender this manuscript. The two articles mentioned earlier refer to this whole history. I believe that Geber managed to do a fairly good reconstruction of how the manuscript reached Germany and then Sydney. It is less certain where the manuscript was written, where it was produced, where it was kept, and how it reached Western Europe. And what else do we know? That it has been restored last year with funds from the Selby Old Foundation. So this is pretty much it, which is very little. And it's a pity, and now I'm a crusader. I'll try to speak out, speak up, and draw attention to this manuscript, which is interesting for a number of reasons, and I'll mention a few of them soon. So, a context. If you look at the library's catalog, you'll see that Codex Angus is called a Lectionary. The description is that it is a liturgical book. In other words, it's not the New Testament in its entirety. It's a selection of passages from the 4 canonical Gospels, the Gospels including the New Testament. This selection doesn't include all those readings or the entire text of the 4 Gospels. It's a selection of passages, indeed meant for liturgical use. What's interesting is that the object itself, this Gospel Lectionary, technically called Evangelistarion, whatever, the book of the Gospels, serves the needs of a community for a whole year. So it illustrates a yearly cycle of readings that, in this case, are mainly located in what in the Orthodox tradition we call the liturgy. The common term used in Western Christianity is the Mass. Why I say this? It's because other lectionaries include more readings. For example, for the cycle of Matins, this one doesn't. So this manuscript is somehow minimalist in that it only includes readings for the liturgy, the Mass, not other offices or services. The annual cycle of readings in the Byzantine Church, because this is a Byzantine product, and the Orthodox churches of Byzantine tradition begins in the night of Easter and ends with Holy Saturday, so Saturday morning before Easter. And indeed, if you go to the first very page of the manuscript, I think I have that page somewhere, just a second. Yeah, that's the first page. Yeah. It begins with an inscription under that frontispiece where it says the Gospel according to Saint John, which is something very interesting. Typical for the Byzantine lectionaries is that cycle of annual readings doesn't follow the order of the New Testament. In the New Testament, the Gospels go from Matthew to Mark to Luke to John. In the Orthodox tradition, or Orthodox churches of Byzantine tradition, it begins with John, goes then to Matthew, then Luke, then Mark, which isn't something like a confusion, okay, the Greeks got it wrong. No, it's a deliberate reconfiguration of the order of readings, and it begins with John because this is that sets the tune, if you like, for the entire year. How are we supposed to read Jesus' story? Is it in the light of Matthew? Well, if we do that, then we understand certain things about Jesus' ministry. But it all changes when you look at that same story, that same narrative through the eyes of John, where the whole idea is, I don't know, more, let's call it philosophical, more interiorized. The Jesus of the Gospel of John is very serene, is in charge, he orchestrates the events, and so on and so forth. And therefore, the community that uses this kind of reading has a certain perception of Jesus and his ministry. So nothing is without some kind of significance for our conversation here. Now, something else that you should know is that this lectionary and any other Byzantine lectionary includes readings for three main seasons or parts of the liturgical year. Those are the words in Greek, Pentikostarion, Oktoichos, Triodion. The 50 days, Easter to Pentecost. Then Oktoichos, the cycle, repetitive cycle of 8 tones, 8 modes of singing, which is the largest portion of the year. And then Triodion, introduction to Lent and the Lenten season. These three seasons are represented here, but not signaled as such. Fancier manuscripts, including manuscripts also ransacked from the monastery of Kostynica, includes indications. They are the illustration is very rich, sometimes lavish, not the case here. So the passage from one season to another isn't so well signaled here, if at all, anyway. And what else you find in a regular Byzantine lectionary? Some appendices, readings for the monthly festivals of Jesus, his mother, saints, Holy Cross and stuff like that. Then 11 readings for Matins, Sunday Matins, and they keep repeating through the year. These are present here. So the monthly festivals and the saints aren't included in this manuscript, but we have at the end of the manuscript, the cycle of 11 matins readings and some other occasional readings, not well represented here. This is the object. When you open the manuscript, you see the cover, which is wooden cover, but also nicely lined with some material. It's quite nice, red and gold. The illustration that you see there, the frontispiece of this first page, is the most elaborated of all. So the rest are quite simple, and this manuscript shines by its minimalism. It's unusual, at least for big cathedral churches or other major churches and monasteries. The manuscripts in the Byzantine tradition were quite heavily ornamented. Not this one, which makes it interesting, unique perhaps, exciting anyway. Now let's turn to some of the things that can be gleaned in regard to the manuscript. This is just a brief description. Of course, you'll have a more technical description catalog. You see there a tiny photo of the end of the manuscript is the last page, a bird. Very interesting, possibly a peacock. It's a symbol. It's a symbol of richness, of eternity perhaps, lavishness. And it may be not only a quirk of copyist or of the writer, it could be a deliberate illustration there. It shows the Gospels are the fountain of life and richness. I won't give you any further details. What's important is the fact that, as you can see, there's little ornamentation, so the copyist didn't do too much to make it nice. There are some indications there where you see some reddish lines, for example here. Yeah? They indicate a new passage, but they are very minimalist. And most of those stylized initial letters are T's and E's. It's not that the calligrapher didn't know other letters of the alphabet. It's another strangeness of the Byzantine lectionaries. They always begin with standard introductory phrases. In other words, what you read there isn't the exact text of the Gospel. There's some editing going on, including foremost in the introductory lines. And most of these introductions begin with T and E. Tokero e kino. Yeah, that's the first line here. At that time, there's no E here, but why E? It's because the usual formula is Ipen o Kyrios. The Lord said, and then comes either a parable or a discourse or something. This manuscript corresponds to the usual codices, manuscripts, Byzantine manuscripts of liturgical lectionaries. But it's also very interesting the fact that by and large it corresponds to what we still use across the spectrum in the churches of Orthodox tradition, which is very interesting because the lectionary, the source of the lectionary or the history of the lectionary begins in the 4th century. What we have in this perhaps 12th century lectionary is of course a development, but this development doesn't bring too many changes compared to the 4th century, initial attempts. But it's interesting, and this was one of my surprises. I've been very surprised to see a lot of overlapping between this medieval manuscript and what we use in my own church tradition to this day. It's fantastic. Why, from my viewpoint, is this interesting? Is because this gives us a window into how those people looked at the story of Jesus, and there's some kind of continuity of perception, which for me is very interesting, and perhaps for many in my own church tradition. What else can be gleaned? Well, the writing isn't the best quality. As I said, it's very minimalist. There are some issues, but these issues are very significant. For example, we have full texts for the Paschal season, Easter, Pentecost, with some exceptions noted there on the slide. But then after Pentecost, everything is reduced to 2 readings per week. So instead of having daily readings, we have only 2 after Pentecost, which from my viewpoint is very significant, and I'll get to it in a moment. These are just curiosities. Yeah, I found a misplaced reading. For example, in the Paschal cycle, there's this text splashed there, which belongs to Holy Thursday, so Thursday before Easter. Has nothing to do with the Paschal season. It's obviously a mistake of the copyist. Then there are some elements like what you see there that indicate the fact that this manuscript was used previously for another text. So it's a palimpsest, written again. While in the article of Geber, it says, well, it's not a palimpsest. So my thoughts, and I'll finish with this one. We have these very scarce illustrations. There's this stylistic minimalism that is characteristic of this manuscript. And there's nothing like the richly ornate 13th century manuscripts that we have, even from that same monastery of Kostinica. So I don't think it was written in Constantinople. Possibly this was written in the monastery's own scriptorium. The literacy of the copyist isn't high standard. The letters, well, the text is quite legible in most places, but not always. But the way some writers today are very generous with their commas, semicolons, and all that, splashing them everywhere. So the same here with diacritical. So the accents are wrong, and so on and so forth. There are many typos. I don't think it's written in Constantinople. And then there's this strangeness of the reduction of the readings from daily readings in the Paschal season to 2 readings per week for most of the year. Why is this interesting from my viewpoint? This shows the real rhythms of life of the community that paid for this manuscript. They could not afford having liturgies every day because they would not read the scriptures on their own. They would read the scriptures together. That was the traditional approach. And they could meet only on Saturdays and Sundays, and therefore they had readings for those days, which shows something about the community that used this text. And it's not a big urban community. It must be either a very small monastery called Skiti or a regular parish somewhere in the mountains of northwest Greece. Very interesting. Also interesting is the fact that there are so many variations from the mainstream established Byzantine lectionary that this manuscript represents a lost manuscript tradition. And this is something that should be further explored. This is something that might be very significant because it could tell us something else about the community that used it. To use this manuscript that illustrates a different manuscript tradition, different textual tradition, when there's an established official text, could be an act of defiance. Anyway, I have much more to say. My time is up. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take.
Thank you, Doru. That was very interesting. And I think from something that looks, yes, quite unassuming, and in comparison to some of our other manuscripts, it is a little bit of an ugly duckling, dare I say. But it does sound like there's some stuff that's there to follow up. We do have time for a couple of questions, if there were any. Do
think there were different calligraphers involved?
In a few places, you can see different hands. Yeah. I mean, one is quite inexpert.
Yes. Was it used as a reading to a congregation? How was it used, or did people?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. Actually, this manuscript shows a heavy use. It has been really used by a congregation, a real congregation, but because in the Byzantine tradition, the gospel passages aren't read by members of the congregation, they are read by either the deacon or the priest. It was used by them, and they didn't take too much care of it. There are splashes from time to time. You see wine. I assume it's not coffee. So, but there are stains of wine. You can see them, you can spot them. So it was actually used not for private use, for congregation. So there's the priest or the deacon coming in front of the congregation and reads, well, this is the reading for today. You know, and then comes the sermon, stuff like that. But it was, the fact that it shows as it does, it shows that it has been heavily used for a number of centuries.
Two questions. Is there a colophon or any ending that indicates that this is a complete work? And the second question is, are there only 3 seasons in the Orthodox Church year, not 4?
Why?
Why is there no Advent or?
Ah, well, yeah, very good.
Sorry, that's from my ignorance.
Yep, thank you for the question. So as you see at the bottom of the slide, on the last folio, 122, which includes text, there's a formula, glory to you God, glory to you, doxasi o Theos, doxasi, which shows it's done. Yeah, so it's complete. The other question, why there's no Advent? Well, Advent is part of a different kind of liturgical time, and unfortunately this manuscript doesn't include those monthly readings. So what we have is the main 3 liturgical seasons, but not the cycle of festivals, for example. You don't find that here. But this doesn't mean that we could not reconstruct the readings of pre-Christmas, even based on this manuscript. I haven't gotten there yet, so I'm like, I did only a quarter of it. But there are readings that are part of the Sunday cycle before Christmas, and they are there, I checked.
You said that after Pentecost, the readings go from daily to just 2 a week. Do you know if the readings they've chosen for Saturday and Sunday deviate from other more complete lectionaries, or are they the conventional Saturday-Sunday choices?
Great question. No, they're the standard readings. So I checked, so I went up to the 12th week after Pentecost, and all checks out. And this, I mentioned this earlier. It has been a great surprise for me to see how much overlap is between this lectionary, 12th century or earlier or later, and what the Orthodox Church has used to date.
Was there anything in the conservation or the bindings that were informative in some way, apart from the text itself?
Well, I haven't looked at that aspect. Perhaps Barbara can tell you more about it. Yeah, so I'm not even a paleographer. So I looked at this manuscript through the eyes of a 21st century Orthodox person who wishes to understand where his tradition comes from. I'm certain that there's much more that an expert can find in this manuscript. It may be, as I said, even that nice bird illustration, at the end of the manuscript shows a certain, and I don't think it's something for aesthetic purposes there. I think it's more a matter of saying, well, this bird symbolizes life, symbolizes freedom, symbolizes richness, It's a peacock. It's a very powerful symbol, and it shows what the Gospels were for these people. But I cannot go beyond this point.
Would it be possible to hear from Barbara something about the restoration process?
I'm totally unprepared for that, but as far as I know, no chemical analysis of the materials have been done. So
I think this was purely to make it safe to handle one. Yeah.
Can't really sort of tell exactly how old it is or whatever. So, It was tricky, I can tell you that. It took me 3 attempts to put it back together again.
Is the binding in any way original or?
Yes, absolutely, all of it.
Right.
Except for the little adjustments I had to make, which are of course not original.
Which is another strong point for this manuscript. For example, other manuscripts from the same monastery, because I checked the catalog, have lost their binding, have lost their covers. This one has the original cover.
Might leave it there. Thank you again, Doru, and I'm sure you'll be happy to stick around for some questions. The item is also, as you see here, so please do feel free to come up to have a look at that. And otherwise, we look forward to welcoming you back to more Rare Bites in the future. And Doru is also having another sort of larger event as a culmination of the fellowship in October, the date being
18th or 19th.
Invitations will go out anyway, promotions. But thank you all again once again for your support and interest, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. So it's the 19th of October.
19th
Yeah,
of October.
it'll be like a 40 minutes presentation, more technical.